I'm going to start off with my palette and mix up a glaze that is a very loose, watered down, diluted glaze. It's got some warm greens in it, a little bit of raw umber, a little bit of yellow ochre, and a little bit of golden green, just to kind of give us a background tint. But if you have, I don't know, maybe 70% water, 30% pigment, that should be about the right consistency. I'm using a really big brush, you can see here, to just do some real sloppy splatter. I'm going to lay the brush down here along the edge of his back and a little bit up into his hood, and then just kind of do a really quick little dry brush splatter, pulling it across the white paper. Just throw a little bit of a splatter on here with just some good juicy wet paint to give movement to this once we get going. I'm going to bring some of that same paint right down across his pant legs, and we'll let that dry. And because you can see it's just a real big puddle of water here. Hopefully you can see the bottom part of this is just like a big lake, but that's going to dry really nice. So I'm going to set my palette down and move this gently somewhere else so that it is out of the way, and grab, where'd my other board go? Here it is. This is another board, just blank. And what I want to do with this rest of this session that we're going to do for the splatter part is I want to get some water on my brush, and I'm using any kind of a big brush that holds a lot of water. It could be a mop brush, it could be a calligraphy brush. A round brush probably wouldn't. Most round brushes are synthetic, so they're probably not going to hold as much water. But what I want to do is mix up sort of a kind of a neutral grayish, might add a little bit of lavender to this, a little bit of Payne's gray, a little bit of cobalt blue. So it's a cool glaze, just a lot of wet water with just a little bit of coolness to it with either cobalt or ultramarine, whatever you feel like. I'll pull my palette over here so you can see what I'm doing. I'm just mixing up a nice wet mixture, just a touch of Payne's gray and a lot of cobalt, and then adding shovelfuls of water into my mixing area. So I have a nice little puddle of pigment so that my brush is fully charged with a lot of water. Now I'm going to set my palette down. I don't need that right now. And I'm going to just take this and kind of tap some little splatters along kind of a horizontal area here across my paper. Might even pick up a little bit of that green that we were using for the little boy. But I want to go back and cool some of this off here with just a little bit of wet. And now I've created some intermixing little splatters across here. That my board is elevated. I'm on a work surface that's got about a 10% elevation, and you can see all of the water is pooling up down here at the bottom. So now's the time to take a round, and I'm going to wick up a little bit of that puddle that's at the bottom and wipe it off on a rag so that I've got a little bit more control, and I don't have quite so much of that puddle pooling at that bead puddling at the bottom of the shapes. If you need to, you can take a tissue and just gently pick up a little bit of that excess moisture. But now I'm going to maybe take a little bit of that stuff and pull some vertical strokes out of this. These might be legs back in here somewhere. Pretty gentle. And I'm going to take a little bit of that same darker bluish pigment that's a cool deal, and I'm going to run maybe a couple of stripes across here just to indicate that these might be shadows. Doesn't take much, just a quick little stroke, and we'll let that dry. So we're going to come back and develop these into people. But before we do that, before we leave this, I'm going to actually create maybe a scooter or something like that. We'll put a bigger blob right over here on this side, bring it down, and who knows what this is going to be. It's going to develop into something kind of fun. We'll add a little bit of burnt sienna to that while it's wet, so that the burnt sienna can mingle with that cooler blue shape. And we'll just let those two colors just kind of collide and mingle and mix right on the paper in a big wet shape, and not worry too much about it. Might even add a little bit of ultramarine blue in that, and it's going to kind of mingle and mix with that burnt sienna. And so we'll get a little bit of a bronzy mix mixed in with the blue, and it'll be a nice, interesting shape there. Maybe one of these center pieces here, we'll add a little bit of the same color while we got it on our brush. Just drop it into that wet area and leave it alone. So this is looks pretty random, kind of like Warsaw sketches or whatever they call when you go to see the people about being a little nuts. We'll put some legs on some of these, just nothing too obvious, and we'll let that dry. Then once that has a chance to kind of settle down, I'm going to wick up a little bit of this, take a bigger brush, and I'm going to just add some water across here, and then just add a little bit underneath some of these guys. It's just a wet, clean water. And then I'll take a little bit of this, the same mix that I just mixed up, and we'll touch the top of that wet part and let them run down. And these will become shadows or reflections of these people that we eventually develop. We'll just let that wet brush grab that pigment and just kind of run down into the dry paper beneath these shapes that are more or less just kind of laid in here very loosely. And I think what we should do at this point is just let this dry. So I'm going to set this on a table next to me or a work area that's level, and we won't worry about that until it has a chance to dry. So we're going to go back now to our other painting. And is this like a really kind of awkward feeling for some of you to do two paintings at the same time? I think it can be a lot of fun, particularly when you're dealing with water media, because a lot of times you need to let things dry by themselves and not try to force the issue with a hairdryer. And this gives you an opportunity to kind of jump back and forth and keep things loose and not worry too much about how they dry, and just see what water does. I'm taking some of this big lake here and this bead of water that's collected at the bottom, and wicking some of that up and just wiping it off. If you use a tissue, you can use that as well. Just kind of take your brush, but don't use the tissue to touch the paper, because then it'll blot these beautiful little wet marks. But let's think about, as I look at my photo reference, we've got some highlights on this child's snowsuit. The highlights are the value that we've just laid down. We need this to dry so we can come in and put the dark shadowed surfaces. So we've got a light source that's kind of coming from above and catching the front of him. The back side is going to be darker against where we pulled all that pigment across the white paper. So it'll be easy. And I got a little bit of green on her arm, so I'm just going to kind of feather that away so that I don't have a dry line there where it dries with a hard edge. So let's, the one thing we can do is we can play with his shoes at this point. I'm going to put in some yellow ochre, just a nice warm color. And we'll just leave the bottom soles of his shoes white, because that is part of the way these little trainers are, these that kids wear or we all wear. And we'll come in with a shadow underneath it to make that show later. But by putting this in here now, we can have a little bit of fun. I'm going to go to his hand and get a little bit of orange with some gamboge, and we'll just kind of mix up a flesh tone here, maybe a little pink in there with it. and just give a little touch on the back of his knuckles coming down the back side of his upper side of his wrist, leaving the top part of his fingers a little lighter in value. And it works out pretty nice that way. You can even add a little bit of pyro red in there if you want to get the back side of his hand just a little warmer. Keep in mind, it's going to dry 50% lighter than what it shows. So you need to be dark enough to be able to make that read. I'm going to use some of the yellow ochre from his shoes and mix it in with some of the flesh tone. So it's a little bit warmer for her hand. And I'll do the whole hand first with this one value. And then after it dries, we'll come in and put the darker value beneath her knuckles going down her wrist. And we'll just, they're both kind of holding hands there. She's kind of arranging his hood, and we'll put some darks in there after this dries, but just dropping those in there helps. I think while we've got this same mixture, I'm going to put a light value right up in her forehead, behind her glasses, coming down her cheekbones, her nose, and right down into her neck. But I want to add a little bit of pink. I use quinacridone rose, and I'll add that just underneath her throat a little bit, and a little bit up in her forehead under her hair where it's in shadow, and then a little bit closer to her ear. And then her nose, I'll just touch a little bit of pyro red in with this flesh tone, and we'll get just a little bit underneath her nose. But this is all wet, so the pigment just kind of blends around very nicely in this wet shape. We can always come back and add a little bit of dark shadows, but we've got to let this base coat kind of dry. I want to also bring some of that same color right up into her hair, because as we look through people's hair, you still see the same flesh tones. If you don't do this, it's like you're painting a cap on somebody. So you've got to allow that same flesh tone to flow right up through her hair. And in this case, I'm going to take my wet brush and just pull some of that into the background, just so it tints the paper slightly. And we'll darken that probably a little later, but it just kind of loosens that edge. It's like a lost edge. And we'll come back with darks and define the shape of her hair later. But we've got to have this initial coating that goes down. I left a little bit of white along the stem of her glasses and the tops of her glasses. We can always darken those when we darken everything else later. I'm going to add a little bit of the same flesh tone that we just kind of worked up, and just throw a little bit of that into the this wet area beneath him. Now, while we've got this, and I'm watching my surface of my paper, it's still pretty wet. So we want to take a dark eventually here and start working on her base coat of her sweater. And it's a kind of a long mid-thigh length sweater with a belt around it. It comes down while that base coat goes down as a very kind of light gray, kind of a cool gray. We'll come in with darker, drier paint to create the shadows beneath her arms and in the folds. But that all has to happen while, that initial coat, that works. While we've still got this mix on our brushes, we want to mix up a little bit more in our round and capture her knee. Now, the knee is exposed through a tear or ripped jeans. The fashion is to have these ripped jeans frequently. So what I'm going to do is get it. It's a cylindrical shape. So we've got to rinse our brush, and we have to kind of lift some of that paint on that bone, right on the cap of the kneecap, where it gets a bit of a highlight, and come in with maybe some raw umber and a little of that pink to darken the underside of the kneecap so that it feels like it's in shadow. And it's pretty wet right now, so I'm going to really wring out all the moisture off my brush with a tissue and just kind of twist it right up on where the kneecap would be. And if it needs to have a little bit more dark, right where the leg folds back into the jeans, just add a little bit of that quinacridone rose and you'll be fine. We're going to come in with a darker blue jean or denim color above that, so that'll create a nice contrast. So it's not like it's real complicated. It's just a very pale, light look. And I just lifted a little bit of that highlight off of her, the top of her knee. So we'll let that settle down. And while we're waiting for that to kind of dry, I'm going back to their hands. Their hands are probably dry enough that I could go back and pick up a little bit of raw umber and mix it with that little bit of rose color. I'll show you what I'm doing. It's just barely a little bit darker, a little bit drier. It's not quite as wet as my initial wash. And now I can come back and right between their hands a little bit, drop in a little bit of shadow, and where her wrist disappears down into the sleeve of her jacket. And then I'm going to pick up just a touch of the rose color, maybe add a little bit of burnt sienna to that as well. And I want to come in right underneath her knuckles that are in shadow. So it feels like there's, the top of her fingers are in sunlight, and then everything else kind of is in shadow going down into her arm. The same thing is going to happen with her right behind her, below her ear and kind of under her throat. I just lay some of these little colors down, and then I take a damp brush and just smooth them out so that we feel like, okay, her under her chin and down her throat is in shadow. We want to do the same thing where her forehead disappears up into her hair. We want to add just a little bit of darker value. And then I clean my brush and just wipe all the water off, and I push a damp brush towards that darker deposit of paint, and it just smooths everything out, makes it a little nicer. Later, we'll go back and add a few more shadows around her cheek and highlight where her cheek is raised. But for now, I think that's pretty good. I'm going to lift a little bit of this off of her wrist and then come in behind his knuckles, and on the shadow side of his wrist going down into the sleeve, we darken that. We're going to move away from the flesh tones and get into his the shadow colors of his snowsuit. So I'm not sure if I have any sap green. I don't think I do. So I'm going to make sap green. I just use a Viridian and a little bit of raw umber and get some of this darker mix here. You can see it's not all that wet enough so that there's enough water on my brush for it to flow off the brush. But I'll start with the back of his hood, and everything has dimension. It's three-dimensional. So it's got shadow side, it's got a soft form shadow as it comes into the light. So I just tickle that edge of the dark as it comes forward towards the front of his hood. Just a little bit on the top of the hood is just slightly warmer coming down into the visor, just so we can see it a little bit on the top. And then as we go down the neck, there's folds around where the hood kind of folds in around the actual body of the bodysuit. And I'm just moving down along the edge of this back. There's a big wrinkle that comes out halfway down his back. It sticks out. So beneath that is going to be in shadow. Above it is going to be in light. So I want to have some darker darks and then soften those where they transition to the lighter light. And we'll just I might even add a little bit of blue in a couple places, a little cerulean blue. And then I want to actually create a little bit of shadow beneath the elbow so that we actually see the shape of the elbow. But we have to have some folds in it as well. I'm going to add a little bit of raw umber and come into some of these folds and crinkles on his arm, where the elbow folds together, and then moving down into the lower part of his seat. He's got some folds here that are darker, and then the leading leg that's closest to the viewer is going to be a little darker than the one behind, because it's more defined, and we'll have the one behind it, it'll be just a little bit more vague. So we'll have a little bit of dark back there, but not nearly as dark as the leading edge. So I'm going to even add a little bit of ultramarine to this mixture of greens to get a nice bit of fold, you know, the shadows that are within the folds coming down his backside. And I'm just going to add a little bit of a damp brush to some of these marks to smooth them out. And then as we get up into the space between mom and the boy, everything gets a little bit darker. So we've got to really define the darks back in the front of them, because it's all in shadow. And there's a little bit of fold around the sleeve opening. Clean my brush and just soften some of this so it's just not a real hard edge. And then down behind his wrist, up by his chest, we need to get pretty dark. So I'm going to get some raw umber added to the mixture with the cerulean, or with the ultramarine, and really kind of get dark down in here behind. And then as we come down his front, there's going to be a shadow on the front of his outfit. And as this all dries, I can come back in and drop a little bit more dark in a few places, but for now, this is a start. We want to let this dry and then come in on top of it with more layers, so we have more of a layering effect. With his shoes, I put a little bit of raw umber on my brush, kept it pretty dry, and I'm creating a little heel cap on the back and some striping on the trainers, and maybe a little bit of shoelace in there, just a flick of something, so it just suggests that there's something on his shoes. Use some of that same color on the rear heel that's warmer than the snowsuit, so we recognize that there's something back there. His hood has dried. We've got a little bit of a dry line, so I'm going to take a damp brush and just soften that edge so that it works. But the rest of this, I just wanted to dry, and we'll come back and add some darker accents. This will be the base coat for him. So I'll let you get finished with working down through his snowsuit. And remember, we're not trying to do the final impression of the snowsuit. We have to let this dry and then come back in and punch up the deeper shadows of the folds after it's dried. Thing with watercolor, you have to remember that if you keep trying to darken certain things while it's damp, all you're doing is neutralizing. You're turning it into mud. So if we let this dry and just get away from it, it'll dry quite a bit lighter, but it'll give us a nice unified base color of his outfit. And then we can come back in and add really nice little accents to it. I'm going to transition back to the mom in a moment, but I wanted to kind of watch what's happening here and see how that's going. And I see that I've got something on his knee here that is drying too hard. So I'm going to just soften that just a little bit and make sure that some of these marks, just with a damp brush, it's clean, there's no paint on it. So I'm just using that to kind of soften some of these marks. All right, now, I think probably what might be the next thing to do are her jeans, the mom's jeans, denim. We can mix up a little bit of ultramarine, and I'm just going to kind of show you here in my palette, and then I'm going to add raw umber to that. Raw umber and ultramarine is going to give you a little more accurate color that's reminiscent of denim. If it gets too wet, sometimes, hold on, I got to get rid of this. Let's see. My thing's back. Okay. People tend to want to call me on my phone. I don't know why, but it's disruptive. So, okay. So there's where I'm going. It's pretty dark, but it's going to dry. Ooh, I picked up a little bit of raw umber. If you ever are mixing things up in your palette and you're not happy with what happens, or you pick up a kind of a surprise color that isn't supposed to be there, don't ever be afraid to go back and take a tissue and just wick it all up and get rid of it and start over. It's not a big deal, but it makes a big difference if you have too many colors in there all together, because then it just comes across as a neutral. So I want this to be more of like a cobalt ultramarine with just a slight tint of raw umber with it, and it's not real wet, so I can control how neutral I make this blue. Can you all see? That's a pretty good mix right there for denim. So I'm going to work with the back of her calf right here, and I'm just setting down a little bead of wet paint right on the back side of her calf. I'm going to clean my brush and wipe all the moisture off of it and use that slightly damp brush to just soften the bottom edge of that brush stroke so that it just almost is a lost edge. And it comes forward at a very soft transition from a dark to a light. And then when we get down on the bottom side of her shin, it's gonna, and just beneath her knee, we're gonna go back and get a little darker. So I want to get a little bit more raw umber, a little bit more cobalt, and drop in right underneath that knee where the pant leg picks up again. And we'll just use that paint and pull it right down the front of her shin. And she's got sort of a highlight down the side where the seam is on the jeans. And that gives it a fairly realistic rendition of a pair of jeans. I can always come back later after this dries and I can darken where the calf is pressed up against her thigh. So now that I've got that, I want to just take that same color and just pull it right up into the thigh using the wet paint that's on her calf and come right on across the top of her thigh. It all looks kind of the same value at this point now. It's really, we're basically spreading that same value across her entire upper and lower part of her jeans. And once this settles down and starts soaking into the paper, I'm going to mix up a drier mix of dark, more cobalt, a little bit of raw umber. So a little drier and a little darker. And I can come in on the kind of above her calf in her thigh area, which is in shadow, and add some dark. I'm going to clean my brush and just keep the top of this really light, because the leg on the other side is going to be darker and create a negative shape out of that upper thigh that's in the light. And then as well, coming down the front, I'll get the front of her shin a little bit darker. And we basically created a nice three-dimensional form just using that one set of colors in it. What we're doing is we're regulating how dry or how wet the brush is to move that existing pigment around. Okay, now his snowsuit is still too wet to come in with that other leg on the other side. If we did that, that blue is going to run all into his snowsuit. So we have to let that dry. All right. So I'm going to set this aside. And I'll bring back our little crowd of people that was just kind of splattered there. And lo and behold, it's dry. So now, using this small round brush that I've got, I'm going to start enhancing these little splatters into different people. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a really fairly dark, I'll use some burnt sienna and some ultramarine and get a nice kind of dark color. And I'm going to create, maybe I got to get enough water on here that it'll come off my brush. But a little cobalt and a little bit of the burnt sienna. I'm going to create some handlebars here for a scooter. And we'll come down with a fairly dark from that same scooter thing. And then I'm just going to take a damp brush, a little bit of moisture on there and pull it down forward. I'll add a little bit of the flesh tone that we had from the when we were doing the lady. And we'll put the guy's face here. And then take let's say we're going to use a red outfit. I'm going to clean my brush and just push some darks, and I'll pick up a little bit of bright violet, get those, so he's got a little bit of dark in there. I'll leave a little bit of white above those handlebars. And then maybe we get some blue, cobalt, and we see a little bit of the leg in there. And maybe he's got a bit of something on his head, maybe it's hair. But all of a sudden there's a person and he's on a scooter, and maybe we need to put a headlight on there. So I'm going to just take a clean brush and just wiggle it kind of where the headlight would be. And then after that dries, I'll put a little shadow on the other side so it pops off the page. Now we got people walking towards us, but let's think about a crowd of people. The eye level, regardless of how far away they are or how close they are to us, is always going to be at head level or eye level. And what determines whether they're close or far is how big their body is or how far down it comes into the foreground. So we're going to take a little bit of, I'm going to use a little bit of this bright violet and create maybe somebody over here. He's got a little bit of dark, and I'll leave a little bit of room there for maybe a jacket coming together or the neck on his outfit. And I'm just allowing some water to move this pigment around, get a little bit of darks in here, and then pick up some dark for pant legs. And way people move is they don't always show both legs consistently. You might see one leg coming towards us and the other leg is a little behind. So if we try to be real specific about people, it ends up looking a little bit wonky. So I'm going to maybe give this guy a bag or something that he's carrying. Maybe he's got something over here and he's got a thing. Maybe he's on a bike. He's on a bike. He's coming towards us. There we go. Then we'll have another person next to that. We'll pick up some kind of a fleshy color for a face. And this is a small person over here. They're farther back. There's another person. They're all kind of overlapping each other. So I'm going to get a little bit of a warm, maybe a little bit of a cerulean blue. And this person is just a little bit in front of the one behind. But that big puddle of light blue pigment is going to transition into some warmer pants. And then add a little bit of blue in there. And then go back and get some of that green or blue that was, maybe he's got a briefcase. Or he's carrying something. And then this person is pretty tall. He's a little taller than the guy next to him. So we'll give him a little bit of a darker complexion. Don't make their heads too big, because if you make their heads too big, they'll look like they're big pumpkin heads. But we want to try to maybe keep this guy a little cooler. So maybe he's got a little bit of he's coming along like that. You don't have to do much, just a couple of little quick strokes and you've got people. And then maybe there's a lady there next to him and she's in a dress. We'll give her a kind of a teal outfit, and then her legs are exposed. So we'll get some warm legs coming out of this dress. And then I'll just clean my brush and just tickle that color that I put down, and maybe part of it is an arm coming out, but it all gets blurred and lost and together. We'll add a little bit of warmth, maybe some gamboge and a little bit of warm green, a golden green, something like that. And we'll have person back here that's kind of in between these guys. We can't really see what's going on. All we see is a face back there. I'm just going back in and putting some faces in here with the minor little small round, getting some warm suggestions of the facial features. I mean, not even defining faces, we're just putting the heads in there. And then come in beneath that with a little bit darker images, and let them tuck behind each other. Your people will look much more effective if they're overlapping each other and they're connecting a little bit, and you basically have them some of the colors from one just bleeding right into the next one, because that way you're not sure, as you look at a crowd of people coming towards you across the street, a lot of times the shapes all just kind of blend one into the other. And that's the kind of the impression we want to create here, is that we've got this melange of legs and stuff coming across, and there's lots of stuff going on, but you only see little bits and pieces of it. Now we've got this scooter here. I mentioned I was going to come in underneath the headlight with a dark. So I'm going to add a little bit of ultramarine and burnt sienna and just create a little bit of dark there. As it comes down, he's got his front wheel. And then we've got a little bit of shadow. Let's see, which way's the light going? We'll make them go this way. And maybe add a little bit of red in there, just some darks in a couple places. And then add a little bit of darker warmth on maybe part of his head or his hair. And then this guy on the bike, we've got, get a dark in there, and we'll add a little bit of a just keep it, allow some of these colors to all run together. It doesn't really matter how perfect they're, because we're creating an impression. And if you come back with your neutrals on your brush that's fairly wet, you can get some nice little shadows that are going across this thing. And you've created a little vignette of people. And this is a great way to populate your painting. Don't try to be too perfect. Don't try to define each one individually. Think of them as a group, and you will have much more interesting rendition. And don't try to get them all, completely defined. You want to just give us bits and pieces of these people so that they really kind of all feel like they're moving along, and they're not having a lot of definition. So I'm going to give this gal, maybe she's got a bit of a belt on. This guy's got a tie. Let's give him a little bit darker tie in here through his coat. And then he's got behind his arm, he's got some warm shadows in there. This person, maybe he's got something going across his arm there, and his pant legs come down. But you're just playing, and it's a playful way to create abstract shapes that tend to look like people, give us just enough information that they don't be necessarily your center of interest, but they populate your paintings, give some energy and some activity to your painting that otherwise might not be there. So it's a fun way. We'll come back to this. I'm going to set it aside, but if you want to take a last look at this. This is more or less what we're hoping to achieve with a group of people that are kind of moving towards us. And you can put people on bikes, you can put people on motor scooters, you can put children in there. Maybe if we wanted to add a little child or something, we've got a little kid over here and a light blue outfit or something, and he's
Randy, is there any way that you can zoom in a bit?
Yep. Dragging these kids along, her child along, and And you just smudge it out with your brush. You don't have to have everything defined. I think that one of the fallacies we have is we feel like everything has to be perfectly defined. And the reality is, the less you define, the more we believe what we're seeing. We start to see lots of stuff because our imagination takes hold. And if we try to be too specific, everything gets a little stiff. So that's a one way to kind of approach it. You can always, if you get something that feels a little too dark, I'm looking at this in the camera screen and it looks a little darker than it is in reality. You can just take a damp brush that's clean, and you can always just twist that brush and lift a little bit of value if you feel like you've got too much somewhere. And all of a sudden, it's just like a little highlight on the surface of something just by twisting your brush and lifting a little bit of that value. So it's a fun way. I hope it gives you something to kind of chew on a little bit for some of your future paintings. Let's go back to our mother and child now that they've dried. I'm going to come back and we'll look at the reference here. I'm going to back this up just a little bit, and so you can see. There you go. And what I want to do is now create some darks. We're going to create some darks, and remember I said we're going to create basically a base coat for her sweater skirt. I think that's what they might be called. I'm going to use a cerulean blue with just a touch of Payne's gray, and we'll just kind of drop in these colors they're going to be darker than what we're putting in now, but I'm just laying down kind of a base coat. And I use a lot of water to take the initial deposit of paint and drag it across the dry paper to fill in a nice clean, I guess you call it a glaze. We're just kind of glazing in a wash over her outfit. And you can see it's very diluted. There's not a lot of, I'm not attempting to do a whole lot of definition at this point. I'm just dropping in value. Now leave a negative shape for where her belt would be that's securing the sweater, because she's got like a little fanny pack on there as well. And we'll just kind of come down and drop this all in underneath that. And because we're using kind of a wet wash, this shape is now damp. And I can now take a much drier mix of pigment, and I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna, a little bit of the Payne's gray, maybe a little bit of raw umber. And I'm going to come back in right behind her elbow here and drop in a nice dark. And it's pretty dry and it doesn't go anywhere, but it does soften and feather out a little bit right in that little space behind her arm. I've got enough of this mixed up on my palette. I can come in now, kind of behind her belt and under her belt, come down and define that. As she's bending over, you can see the form of her shape of her body, and pick up a little bit more of the raw umber and the cerulean blue. And I can come and really add a nice dark where it pinches in behind that leg. And I'm going to add a little bit more warmth in here with some raw umber. Just spread that around a little bit. And then as it comes across the top of her thigh, we just take a dry brush and I just kind of lighten that a little bit. I don't want it to get real dark. I want it to have a highlight. But then as it drops down into the folds between on the other side of her leg, we want that to be pretty dark. So I'm going to have that kind of curve and wrap over the top of her jeans. We'll add a little bit more cool to the Payne's gray mixture. And this stays really dark over there. And now we can go right up underneath her arm and do the same thing. And it's feathering in there fairly nicely. I'm going to come back and clean up that edge with a little bit of water and drop this darker pigment, this darker mix down into the folds above that belt. And then a little bit right over her back to define where these little folds in her sweater are. Now, I want to clean my brush. I'm going to get a brush. I have this little 1/2-inch flat brush. You can kind of see what I'm looking at. It's fairly stiff. I just want it slightly damp. And I can use this to kind of lift the highlights out of this damp pigment. I can reshape the bottom side of her arm a little bit. It's a great tool to use if you want to lift a little bit and create a little bit of a highlight. I'm painting on the wrong thing here. Here we go. And now I want to go back to my round, and we'll work with a little bit more cool, like just a touch of the cerulean blue. And I want to cut in on her arm and just create a transition that's a little cooler on the underside of her arm, leaving the highlight along the top of her shoulder and the top of that arm. And as it disappears down in behind that arm, everything gets darker. It has to get darker. So we're going to put all that in shadow. And then the other arm, her other arm on the other side, we're going to get that a little darker, then clean our brush and just push a damp brush towards that deposit of paint so that it feathers away from this nice hard edge and creates a softer transition. We'll get a little bit of that cerulean blue and create a cuff on her jacket, and then come in a little bit underneath that with a bit of a shadow. Just soften it and then soften that edge just slightly. And then I'm going to go back to my little flat brush that's slightly damp. And I want to really redefine that edge, the top edge of her thigh. And where was that other part there that I was looking at? The drape of her coat under her arm as it comes down. We want to pull some of that pigment away. So it's starting to take shape. I'm going to have to go back and darken this some more, but I want this to dry. The mistake we always make is we keep trying to darken and darken and darken, and without letting it dry, and then everything just loses all of its vibrancy. So you want to just kind of get in and get out with this. Let me get my brush out of here. There it is. Okay. So while I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm going to come back and get the little shadows in the snowsuit. I'm going to use a little bit of that Payne's gray that I used on her sweater, mix it with my greens. I've got a Paraline green that I'm using that takes it down nice and dark. And I'm going to come back in now and re-emphasize some of these little folds that are on the backside of his snowsuit. And it just kind of punches everything up. We've got some little folds where the elbow twists together. We'll come in and put those in, and then underneath the elbow, we want to define that as a nice shape that comes forward as a negative shape by putting dark behind it. And then coming down behind his thighs, I want to get some of that same dark. And then he's got little folds in his outfit that come down that leg. I'm going to clean my brush and drag some of this darker pigment right over his little rear end. We'll take a little bit of the raw umber and then get a little bit of that on there. That's a little too dark, so we'll add a little bit of water to it. There. And now the bottom of his pant leg is going to be just a little darker than his tennis shoes. And then the one in the back is going to have that bit of wash coming down and defines it as a little bit darker. And then I want to take sort of a golden green and a little bit of raw umber, sort of a wash, and just maybe add just a touch of gamboge to that, brighten it. And then we'll put that right across the side of his hoodie, and then come down his bit of his elbow that comes forward, and then down across the hips. And what I'm doing is just this touch of gamboge in with that golden green mix just brightens it and gives a little bit of warmth as it comes closer to the viewer. We'll go back to her hands. Let's do that. I'll get a little bit of pyrrole red, and right where her fist is kind of pushed up against his, I want to get a little darker red in there, and it's just barely red. It's got some other junk mixed in with it to neutralize it. And then she's got just a touch of shadow between some of her fingers. So I'll just put a little bit of that in there. And then right underneath his knuckles, I put a little darker as well. I'm going to use that same color to come in right under her jawline, in her throat. It just warms it up. And I'm going to put some of this warmth right up in her hair. In a few places, I start building up some darks as we come towards the viewer. And then I'll get really a nice rich burnt sienna with just a little bit of dark in it. And we'll put some dark accents in her hair. I'm going to go back and get more of a pure burnt sienna now. And we'll put some dry brush in here, just a little bit of dry. And then I'm going to get some Van Dyke brown. Any dark brown that you've got is going to be fine. I want to get a really nice kind of dry deposit of paint. Clean my brush, get all the pigment off of it, because that's a really rich dark. And I can take that and push that dark pigment right up into that warmer stuff and pull it right on across part of her hair. And it's pretty dark and pretty rich. I'm going to add a little bit more dark right up in the shadow where it kind of pinches next to her forehead. And I can kind of put some dark curls in there that are loose, and we'll take something that's sharp, and as that starts to dry, I'll put some little squiggles in there that indicate curls. Gives it a little character. Some of those little details like that are what really make a painting kind of magical, is if you can get those little elements. Now, it's too wet to do that, because if I try to do that, the water will just flow back into the little scrapes. So while we're waiting for that to kind of settle down, I'll get a little bit more pyro red, a little bit of bright violet. I want to get, I don't want it to be real obnoxious red. And I'm going to put a little bit of this red as a dry brush on the underside of this fanny pack. Clean my brush and just tickle that red with a little bit of a damp brush, and it turns the rest of it sort of a pinker color, which suggests that it's got just a touch of highlight to it. I'm going to come in with a little bit of cerulean and a little bit of cobalt, and we'll cut in underneath it in a few places with some darks, so it feels like there's shadow in that red. And then I might even take a clean brush and pull some of that red right down into her pant leg, so it just is like a reflection. But above that, we're going to darken the sweater. It's too wet at this point. So clean your, when you're done with that, we'll clean your brush, and then we're going to finish her other knee, and we'll do her trainers, and then we'll put some shadows beneath it, and then do some finishing touches. But I'm watching her hair, and as soon as that stuff starts to lose the shine of the wet pigment on the paper, I can come back in and do a few little scratch marks. There you can see, you can kind of pull out a few little scratches. That's too wet there. So I'm getting a few, and I'll have to wait for the rest of that. So you've got to really watch it and make sure that the timing is right. I'm going to get a little darker, bright violet on part of this fanny pack while it's starting to dry. And we'll let that settle while you're finishing that up. I want to get a little darker right behind her arm. And then clean my brush. Don't use the same paint, just take a clean brush and push a damp brush towards that darker mark, and it'll feel like it's that dark is going down behind her arm, and we're getting highlights up on her neck where the rest of the sweater is. Maybe I'll put a little bit of a bead around the collar, and that works. And then I'll get a little bit darker red that we use for the backpack and mix it with the whatever gamboge or yellow ochre, and I'll create just a little bit darker area right underneath their glasses and down behind her ear, behind her jawline. Clean my brush and just soften those lines. Whoop, got a little red, got a little black in there. We don't want that. So we'll just take a tissue and pick that up. And we'll get just some warmth and come back in. I'm just going to take some of that dark in her hair and just pull that right down into her neck. So it's almost like a shadow. It's a lost edge completely. And now I think that this dark in her hair is probably just about the right amount of dampness. I can come back in and scratch out some little highlights in her hair. And I can always add a little bit of dark up higher and then scratch that out as well. Yeah, there you go. And then for her glasses, we'll take the same dark that we were using on her sweater. And I'm just going to put a quick slash where her glasses are, clean my brush, get all the water off it so it's just damp, and just soften that so it's just sort of a suggestion of dark glasses without being too perfect. And then I might take a little bit of this red and just give a bit of a under her lip a little bit, and then kind of underneath those glasses where the fold is in her cheek because she's smiling, add a little bit of that same red right behind the ear or in front of the ear. And now she's got a nice bit of shadowing on her face. There we go. I'm going to come back in under her knee and add a little bit of dark there. And now I can go pick up a little bit more of that blue, and we can kind of come in right behind that knee on her pant leg, and we can actually start softening that edge and drop in the rest of the leg on the far side. And I'm going to pick up a little bit of cobalt as we get closer to that knee and drop it into the damp area so that it gets darker as it touches, as it kind of swings back in into the fold between her, where her calf and her thigh are pinched together, and also where it disappears behind the knee with the hole in it. I'm going to put just a touch of dark in one or two spots where that torn knee is, the inner jeans. And then we've got kind of a blue-green, a blue-gray trainer. And I'm going to come back in and just take darker version of what we used in her jeans and come up underneath with some real darks for her trainer. And then the one that's closer to us, it has less dark value. And we'll come back in and just drop a little bit. I'm leaving the little rubber white sole totally white on this because I don't want to lose that. And we'll take just some damp brush and pull it around to the front. And we'll let that dry. And then I can come back in behind with a dark to show where the sole of her shoes are. Now I'm looking back at our little friend. It's time to kind of step back and look at the values and decide, all right, well, now where do I need to add darks? The one thing I want to do is create a little stronger separation between the front arm and the back arm. So I'm putting a little dark on the one and behind, a little bit of a shadow underneath the cuff, clean my brush and soften that edge on that shadow underneath the cuff, and then come down with a little darker value. And I'm just using the brush and the dampness of the brush. There's really not much here on it, and just come down underneath her forearm. And then I want to kind of define the shape of that forearm by coming in with darker on this side of her, under her upper arm. And I can always add a little bit of raw umber to that to warm it up. And it all, because that's damp, it just almost looks like a couple of little folds in there. And I want to add the same thing underneath the arm to make sure that this whole sweater has a feel of being in shadow underneath her, the front of her that's in shade. And it helps define the outline of her arm. So there you go. And we'll just soften the rest of this. And now her shoe has dried. It's really nice that there was enough water in there. It created a little bit of a bloom in her shoe. I'm going to come back with a darker, warmer color and just add a little bit of dark on the back side here, coming down next to that white sole. And then just take some, a little bit of water and pull the rest of that down. So it accentuates that white on the sole of her shoe. And now I can also do the same thing with a little bit of a bright violet or a warm violet, and come back in underneath her fanny pack and really define parts of it. Maybe there's just a couple of little dry marks there that indicate there's some latches or something on it. And that works. And now maybe just a touch of warmth where his face would be. We don't even need to define it. We just take a quick slash and that works. Now, I want to get a little more shading behind him. So I'm just going to take some warm green or golden green and raw umber, a little bit of water to that, and just kind of glaze over this whole bottom part of his outfit, just to give it a little more substance. And I think at this point, I'm going to stop and let you get caught up. And then we're going to soften some of the area around her hair. We're going to put some shadows underneath it. And we'll put a few little finishing touches on before we finish up. So I'll let you keep working on that. It's a lot of fun to be able to do this, to get these people to kind of take shape, take form in front of us. I'm going to clean up a little splatter I had here. See if we can get down closer to what we're doing here. Does that help?
Yes, that makes a difference.
And I've got just a little bit of the reference right next to it so that you can kind of see what we're doing. But the knee that is poking out of her torn jeans is nicely defined as a negative shape because of the dark shadows and the sweater on the part of her outfit on the opposite leg. And I think we probably need to darken that knee just a little bit in order to really make the exposed knee stand out. So I'm going to take a little bit of cerulean blue, mix it up with whatever junk I have. And I'm going to come in on the underside of her leg, the opposite knee, and then soften that edge so that it all just kind of goes into a highlight at the top. But you can see by darkening that just a little bit, that really helps to make that exposed knee stand out. And then I'm going to come back in with a little bit of blue or darker blue right where the pinch is behind her calf. And you can see now that it really makes the other leg come forward. And she's got the shape of her calf as it squeezes up against the, she's squatting down. We want to define that just a bit. So I want to add a little bit more dark behind it and bring that right back in underneath her sweater. But I don't want to have a hard line here. I want to soften this. So I'm just adding a little bit of water, and it gets darker as it kind of drops down into the shadow, as the form of the leg is cylindrical, and we want to try to get the underside of that thigh to feel darker and have feel like light is on the upper part. And then same with the shin. We want this to be just a touch cooler, a little bit of more value on it. So while it's wet, I can just drop in a little bit of value and then just soften that edge. So we still see it. Now, it's irregular. We don't see that nice shape. So I'll wait till this dries and then I can just redefine that with just gently with a drier brush. All right. Now, a bigger brush. I'm going to use where's my mop brush? I have here it is. This is a nice size little medium-sized mop brush. And I'm going to use this to create a little landing area that they're standing on. It's just a cool shadow. I'm going to add a little bit of cerulean blue, a lot of water, and then we'll add some warmth. But now what I want you to be aware of is where her soles are. So I'm going to come up behind those a little bit and then come down and leave the exposed soles as a white negative shape. Come up, and this is where we're defining the gesture of her squatting down is through the soles of her shoes being brighter. I'm going to come right behind him and go right across. Now I want the leading part of this shadow to be much darker and warmer towards us. So I'll add a little bit of burnt sienna to this, maybe a little bit of dry brush as I come across. And then the back side of that shadow has to be really light. So there's some water in there. Now I can take a smaller round, which I have more control with, and I can add a little bit of red in there. I can add a little bit of the greens that we had. All the local colors that we've got in this painting go into this shadow. But the back side of it, I want to just sort of soften that and make it almost disappear. I can take a tissue. I can do any number of things to make that less defined. I have a big flat here. I'm going to just take this with water and just kind of run it across the top of that shadow. And it's going to bleed down into the shadow. It's going to soften the shadow in places. But now I can take my cerulean blue and I can add a little bit of value right in here because it's all wet and it just kind of runs. But I want to keep it fairly level. And then I'll add a little bit of yellow ochre and keep this nice and defined. A little bit of burnt sienna. And then I'll take just water or a clean, absolutely clean, stiff brush. And I can drop a little bit of water into this back side of the shadow. And it will start blooming and give you texture and it'll break up that shadow. It'll be really kind of fun. And I'm going to take the bottom of this just for fun and I'm going to just drag my brush right across that shadow and soften it underneath them. I'll let that dry and I'll come in under their shoes and I'll darken those again. But we have to let that dry. So that sort of gives us a little bit of background behind these figures that helps hold their shapes. While we're waiting for that to dry, think about how we can soften her hair. Just a small round that's slightly damp. I can take some of that hair color and just pull it into the white paper in the background and just soften it a little bit. It just, all we're doing is we don't want to have edges that are real well defined away from our center of interest. And our center of interest is the interaction between these two. So we want to be able to go back after this dries, and we want to be able to really give us a little bit of punctuation, a little bit of interesting things in her glasses, her face, her hand, where she's touching him. That's the interaction that's important in this painting. That tells the story. So maybe a little bit of red in here in his hand, a little bit behind her knuckle, maybe the top finger there. You've got just a little warmer shadow. We have a little bit more warmth in her face, right underneath her glasses, and maybe right in her jaw, underneath her jaw, kind of coming into her throat. We've got just a little bit more warmth. That's too much. There we go. And then where it tucks down into her cuff, maybe his as well. So that's the hot spot there. That's what we're after, is a little bit of suggested emotional interaction. I want to get a little bit of blue on part of her glasses. So I add just a touch of that on the lens that's closest to us. I'm waiting for this shadow in the foreground to dry a little bit, and I'm going to bring back just a little bit of dark underneath her shoe. And then we'll get really dark. Got to get the right combination of a little bit of raw umber and maybe cobalt. And we'll get right, just suggest that there's a bit of a shadow underneath this shoe. He's got a warmer shadow under his shoes. So we'll just come in with a little bit of dark in here. I want to add just, you don't want to do too much with their nose or their mouth, but I want to get just a touch of warmth underneath her nose. And then where her cheek is. It's damp, so when I drop that, just a touch of that warmth, it feathers out and it just is perfect. It doesn't need to have a whole lot of definition to it. It's just kind of nice and soft. That works. A little darker on her kneecap underneath there. And we're home free. I think her sweater needs to be darker than her jeans. You see how everything is drying, and now all of a sudden the underside of the sweater and the underside of the jeans are almost the same color. So I'm going to get a little darker, more of a cool, and come in with now that it's dry, almost a dry brush. And underneath here, I want this to be darker. All right. It reads pretty well. I'm going to take a little bit of the warm green and a little bit of the yellow ochre, mix up kind of a nice warm green splatter color, very wet on my rigger, and I can maybe catch that across there. We back. And then a little bit of blue, cerulean blue. And then using that probably that green, we'll want to use a brush to sign things with. And I've told people, I don't know if all of you have heard this before, but your signature should balance where your center of interest is. It should give you a little bit of balance to the painting. It should also feel like just additional texture. You don't want it to be so abrasive or noticeable that it takes your attention away from it. So I'm going to get this kind of a warm green and sign this right in here. Got to get plenty of paint on your brush and water so that it keeps flowing. And got a big drip coming off of there. There we go. There. Now her shoes went a little flat, so I'm going to add some of this dark in here and just give us a little bit of a accent there where the shoelaces would be. And I think that's probably all we need. We can always add a little bit of blue up underneath the glasses, but I'm happy with that. Let's I'm gonna get rid of this dry line here. When a pigment wash is so light and diluted and you wet the paper, it looks like you don't have anything on the paper, but there's actually, the paper's damp and it's touching pigment. It will pull that pigment out to the edge of where it stops drying. So you have to, when you do that, you have to almost have a tissue or something to get the paper to dry, blot it up that excess moisture. Otherwise, it'll keep pulling pigment out and then it'll leave a very defined dry edge out in the white paper. So you want to try to anticipate that. And if you miss it, go back with a clean brush that's just a little bit stiffer and slightly damp, and you can just soften that and blend it into the area. But then be sure and take a tissue and just slightly blot it so that we don't see that dry line. It's kind of like the ring in a bathtub, you know. It shows up when you least expect it and you're not looking for it. So but anyway, I feel like there's light on the top of her leg, the top of her knee. Her face is interacting with the child. The pigments have dried. They're lightening so much because I use a lot of water. So I'm going to add just a touch of this warm flesh color now that things are dry, and get down in here where his face would be behind those hands, so that we just have just a slighter dark behind those forefingers of the knuckle. And I want to get a little darker of the green right up in around his cuff of his snowsuit, so that we really see that hand. It's all about the hand. It's not about the snowsuit. But in order to make the hand more apparent, you've got to add a little bit of dark in there to make that all work. Get this defined a little better too. There we go. All right, let's see how, I want to see how everybody did when they post these, but I want to go back to our little crowd of people next. Before we do that, one thing I'm doing is I'm getting a really diluted bit of blue, and right behind the sole of her shoe. This is going to look white after it dries, but it's just enough darker in value. It's like a quarter of a step down, or not even 1% down, but it makes that white pop out a little bit on the sole of her shoe. And that's what I'm trying to do, is make that feel very apparent, because that's kind of shows the stress of her squatting down and the weight put on those feet just to, stretch the shoes a little bit. So it makes a difference, and you've got to have that. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. So put a little bit of dark on the front toe there. There we go. So let me back the camera up just a little bit so you can see where we're going. But it's fun. Now the other painting, here's our other crowd. When you get stuff like this, you can always come back in and you can add different elements, but don't make them the center of interest. If you have things that you want to add to it, for instance, if I wanted to create a little bit of emphasis in this, I might come back in with a little bit of water and create a nice soft, vertical in here, but bring it down above their heads and leave some white in there that suggests the shape. And then maybe I switch it to a warmer tone. It starts going warmer. And then it gets darker as it gets right down by their, above their shoulders. And we start to see some highlights in here. And there's no rule or rhyme, that says what's right or wrong. It's more important to just draw attention to what you want your viewer to be looking at. So I'm coming in with this and just kind of creating a strong impression, and then I'll just feather it away to nothing with just damp water on my brush, kind of dry brush it around. But this dark in here now is just sort of a very loose background. And I can always punch that up if I want to get a little more emphasis in around a couple of these people's shapes. And it just adds to the abstract quality of what we're doing. You can actually warm it up, you can cool it down, you can do whatever you feel might be appropriate to your painting. But I'm leaving a little bit of white around the tops of their heads to suggest, that little bit of sparkle that we get across a crowd as we look. And then maybe in the foreground, we might have more shadows coming forward. And these are pretty vague. They don't have to be real strong. They can just be a little chatter of something that suggests, more. And then if this is where your darkest background is, maybe your darkest reflection in the foreground is there as well. And that brings our attention to one part of the crowd. We still see the whole crowd, but we might just, our eye is drawn more to one area where we have all this other activity going on. Let me get a little darker in here. Kind of wild, huh? You're just playing, but you got to be fearless and just throwing in some marks on the paper. This stuff all feels very wet, but by the time it dries, you've got a very watery, watercolor, very fluid, and it feels right. So I'm just going to leave that as is, but you see how that dark behind and a little bit of a sparkle on the tops of their shoulders and heads just sets them apart. And we definitely feel like, oh, wow, some of these people are farther away, some are coming towards us, but they're all crossing the street and coming at us. So it's just a fun way to, out of some initial little bit of splatter that we put on there, we've created these people. You can get as involved with these people as you want. or you can just leave it very vague, but if you wanted to put a little bit of a, darker indication on half of their face, maybe in a couple places, you don't have to do much, but it just emphasizes that there's people coming at us. What do you think? That feel good? It doesn't take much to do these. It's pretty quick. If you overwork it or you stay in it too long, they look a little bit overworked. So I always say, do your thing, get in, get out, and be done with it. Let it be. So it becomes more of an impressionistic approach to painting people instead of more of a rendition or a rendering of people. It's just creating a mood. It creates a population. It creates energy and activity in your painting without drawing undue attention to it. This might be part of a much bigger painting that has a landscape or a cityscape in it, but this might be, coming down the street as they come across the crosswalk. It is appropriate.